Welcome to New York Bio's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode focuses on the future of access to care, featuring Yves Duroseau from Lenox Hill Hospital, Gil Addo of Rubicon MD, and Linda Malek from Moses and Singer.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. We're thrilled you're here with us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. We have an amazing panel of guests today. Linda Malek, partner at Moses and Singer, who works very closely with New York Bio on our equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts and co-chairs the task force that we have across industry. And then we have Gil Addo, who's founder of Rubicon MD, and Yves Duroseau from Northwell Health. And all of the things that we have in common are the fact that we are working together to come up with ways that we can advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in our ecosystem. And you can ignore the very loud car that just drove down the street. The joys of working from home and doing webinars. As always, not only are we thrilled you're here to share information with you, but we hope that you will interact with us during the discussion. We have the chat. There are two ways that you can do this. You can put a question in the chat box, or you can put a question in the Q&A box, and we will see that during the discussion and share that with our guests. With that, I am glad you all are here. We look forward to our discussion, and I am actually going to go off screen so that you will only have 4 people to look at. But never fear, I will be behind the scenes helping to answer your questions. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome to today's conversation.
All right, good morning. I will kick us off here a little bit. So first of all, thanks to all of you for being here. I think this is one of those really great opportunities where we kind of cover the whole spectrum of almost the whole spectrum of care. You know, Gil, you're an entrepreneur. You've started Rubicon MD. Yves, you're at Northwell, and Linda, you have kind of run the gamut in terms of working with startup companies, late stage companies, hospital systems, and everything in between. So I'm excited for this morning's conversation. Just to go around the horn a little bit, we usually tend to start with an origin story, but since there's 4 of us this morning, why don't we keep it reasonably quick? We'll go around the horn, tell us how you got to where you are, and Gil, just for everybody's edification, why don't you give us a little bit more about Rubicon MD? So Gil, why don't we start with you?
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. Excited for the discussion here. So I, as I said, I started Rubicon MD about 8 years ago. Prior to starting the company, was trained as a biomedical engineer, and then kind of transitioned out to the business side of things. Had spent a couple of years managing a lab, and then did an MBA at Harvard, and then stuck around Boston and was a consultant for a life sciences consulting firm called Putnam Associates. Then I left there in 2013 to start Rubicon MD. I may end up weaving a little of the origin story in here to tell you exactly what we do, but
we'll allow it.
We built this really on this big mission to democratize access to medical expertise. And so I had a grandmother who was based in Barbados in the West Indies, and she developed a brain tumor and traveled to Boston for surgery, and then spent 5 years going back and forth on all the management of the tumor. And so I was particularly interested and passionate about taking things that sit in large academic medical centers and institutions like Northwell, and being able to get that expertise out into the community where it's necessary and valuable.
Yep.
And so what Rubicon MD is very simply, it's a platform for enabling primary care to get virtual specialist expertise. So we curate networks of specialists, and we allow primary care clinicians and other clinicians in the community to get ready access to opinions and support from specialists across the country. We're 8 years old now. We're a venture-backed business. We've raised a little bit over $40 million to date. And we support about 6,000 clinicians across 37 states.
Okay. So I am, as usual, I'm bringing with questions here, but we'll finish going around the horn and then we'll come back to it. So Yves, why don't we go over to you?
Sure. So I'm Yves Duroseau. I'm the chairman of the emergency department at Lenox Hill Hospital, which is part of Northwell Health. Northwell Health is the largest healthcare provider in New York State, 20 plus hospitals. And because we're so big also, I have regional responsibilities in VP Western region of the emergency medicine service line, which includes Phelps, Northern Westchester, Staten Island. We have a freestanding ER also in Greenwich Village. So that's the day job, but the real interest is, how do we really deliver healthcare in an equitable way to all? How do we leverage technology to do that? And so I've worked with a lot of startup companies throughout New York City, really trying to fill that gap in between, innovations and incorporating them into large healthcare organizations.
Okay, awesome. Linda, over to you.
Thanks, Eric. I'm Linda Malek, and I chair the healthcare practice at Moses and Singer in New York. But my journey to where I am now started with a real interest in access to healthcare. That's actually why I went to law school. And so I started my career working for a few years at the Corporation Counsel's Office doing healthcare policy and legislation. And then from there came to Moses and Singer. And in that capacity, I've really had the opportunity, as you said earlier, to work with companies and organizations across the spectrum, including public hospital systems, as well as government entities that are trying to increase access to care. And so that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, whether it's through the day job or whether it's through mentoring early stage companies that are trying to find cures for disease. So that's really my passion and what I spend all of my time doing in one way or another.
So do you feel like over the last, let's just say the last 10 years, we can think about things like data interoperability and, telehealth. Do you feel like our health systems have kind of kept up with the pace of technology as best they can? Or, what are kind of some of the best things that you've seen in terms of incorporating new technologies? Because to me, it seems like the field has moved so very fast, and it's actually sometimes more difficult for the healthcare system to take things up at the rate of change.
I can start with that if you'd like.
Yeah, I was going to go to you, and then I'll go back.
Okay. Well, I think it's been interesting because earlier on, I think that there was probably less trust and less coordination between large hospital systems, for example, and companies that really specialized in technology. And so you didn't see that much coordination in terms of trying to keep up. You see much, much more now. And I think that what we saw during the pandemic was kind of a warp speed coordination and cooperation in terms of, just really everyone coming together in the healthcare ecosystem trying to find solutions. And I think that we're going to see that moving ahead as well. So I do think that there's been a lot more of trying to keep up with technology, and I think it's improved a lot over the last year and a half.
Yeah. So Yves, when you're looking at this, how do you kind of balance both your department's need to deliver care and kind of looking at the future, saying we could do this better, right? What's the balance there in your mind? Because to take up anything, it takes effort. Things are going to break. They're not going to run smoothly the first time. How do you balance those responsibilities of really kind of wanting them to move the ball forward, but also needing to kind of keep all the pots on the stove over here?
A very good question. So for us, we have to have some, I would call them guiding principles. Before we look at any technology, there are a couple of things we want to make sure absolutely that they address. Clinical outcomes, quality and safety, access to care. It has to be patient and family centric, the clinical experience, and then financial and operational impact. And then we could throw in health equity, which I don't think should be a separate category, but it's something we need to talk about. So
yeah, it is.
Whenever I look at any technology or advise, these are the guiding principles I make sure that we're addressing. But in terms of, you know, a little bit what Linda mentioned, we were forced to move very quickly to find solutions in telehealth and other solutions. But the reality is healthcare and large healthcare organizations are very conservative. They work on very thin margins, and they don't, startup companies like to fail fast and move on and iterate. Large healthcare organizations want certainty, and they're very conservative. So that's where you have kind of a schism. And to your question, that's always the balance I'm trying to find. So if the company comes in with enough value, we may take the time to assess them, but otherwise there's always that tension.
Yeah, failure isn't exactly built into your model, right? Failure is kind of that's not really something they want to talk about all that much. That's kind of a bad thing. So, Gil, from your perspective, I mean, you've been at this 8 years. Can you talk to us a little bit about, I guess, a bit of the evolution of the company, and what was it like trying to go and get into a hospital system 8 years ago, and what's it like now?
Yeah, well, I think, one of the things, I think Yves hit on it, and, he was there in the very early days. And so I think, you're grateful for the people who do sit at the nexus, who are willing to take chance very early on and have conversations and help you to understand and explore what that other side looks like. But I think the fundamental difference is the data that we have to justify the ROI and the cost effectiveness and quality of the platform, right? When you start on day zero, you can't have that data because just by definition, you haven't been around. Exist. And so I think that's been, for us, and it's not easy to get that data because there's, a lot of what we're doing. So what we've been able to show is that almost half the time this avoids the need to go see a specialist. It avoids unnecessary lab studies. It actually avoids acute admissions, non-emergent ED visits. So there are a number of things that we've been able to quantify, but actually that was as of the last 6 months. And I was working with one of the top 5 payers in the country who could look at their claims data over a 2-year period and see these differentials and run some pretty sophisticated analyses. And prior to that, we had some good proxies, but we were actually underestimating it. And when we first started, we had nothing except literature. So I think the biggest, difference and the biggest challenge is having that validation and that data and that track record, which obviously allows for greater comfort. And when organizations are looking for certainty, you have the data to now say with a high degree of certainty that this is a better tool and service than the status quo. So early on, we relied on a lot of third-party data, and we pointed to the academic literature, and we made sure that we were in line with that. And then we also made sure that we built our program and our platform in a way that as you're running it, you're collecting the data and you're validating the thesis. So as we got more and more clients and more users, we were collecting more data to prove exactly what we were saying. So, people took a chance early because it was a tool that clinicians really liked. But over time, to sell to really sophisticated organizations, you've got to be able to demonstrate that this is better than the alternative for them.
Do you remember early on, do you remember a case or two where after it happened, you looked at it and you said, yep, this is going to work. This is the way it's supposed to work. This is where we provide value, and you hit the ball out of the park. Do you remember any of those?
Oh, I remember those so well.
What was the first one?
I'll tell you the first case, but before that, the first time we knew we were onto something was when we gave it to one clinician or one specialist and a handful of clinicians, and we ran a survey at the end of it. It was a very lightweight tool, but we just said use this instead of referring. And they came back, and in the survey afterwards, they were all gushing about how comfortable and easy this interaction was. And that was when we knew that we were onto something, because we're not clinicians. And then I'll tell you the case that really hit home, where like we're doing something that's, you know, bigger than what we, you know, are really realized here. So it was a 3-year-old girl. She had hit herself near the eye with a popsicle stick, and she had a large gash here, and it wasn't healing well, and the primary care clinician was concerned, and so they took a picture of it and sent it through Rubicon MD to our platform. We had a specialist, I believe it was a dermatologist, who looked at it first. And they looked at it and they said, actually, given distribution morphology and the way this is not healing, I'd actually be concerned that this is herpes. And like, for, you know, as we're reading the case afterwards, that, you know, herpes in a 3-year-old, you know, wouldn't make sense to me. But they said, you know, even more so, given how close this is to the eye, you're actually risking the child losing sight and going, you know, blind. There's a lot of risk if this goes untreated. So mother took child to the ED. It was confirmed that it was herpes. It was treated and everything was, you know, resolved simply. And that was like within the first 100 cases we'd received. And what it turned out was that the child had been sucking, you know, the popsicle stick, and had put it in, and it had become infected. And obviously, you know, because of one of the parents, she, you know, had the herpes virus. And so we, you know, we're like, the PCP wouldn't have caught this without Rubicon MD, and they sent and they told us. And, you know, that was when we knew that, you know, it's not, it doesn't happen every case, but I'd say like every 100 to 200 cases, there's one where you're just like, wow, you know, this is having real impact. And it's beyond what you can, you know, understand and what we really envision. But, you know, it's a humbling thing to, you know, to be a part of improving care delivery.
Yeah, I think everybody in the audience that doesn't have kids will hear that and say, "Oh my gosh, a kid!" Everyone with kids sounds like, yeah, I could see that. Yep, no, I could see how that would happen. So, Linda, if we go over to you, you know, you really, I imagine, have to play, you know, advocate in a lot of ways, right? Because there are, you know, teams that often are, you know, they are just starting out, they don't have a lot behind them, and you probably have to play the middleman role of, you know, the trusted people on the other side of the equation not only look to you for your expertise, but also, you know, what do you think about this? And can you talk a little bit about that in terms of kind of how familiar you have to be with really both sides of the equation? How well do you have to know the solution that these guys are trying to provide, and how well do you kind of have to understand the problems on the delivery side?
Well, I think that in terms of the role that I typically play, I have to both understand and anticipate what, you know, everyone that they may interact with in the healthcare delivery field is going to be concerned about, or be nervous about, or be looking for. And then additionally, I have to think about, you know, what are the government oversight authorities going to be thinking about and looking for? So healthcare is such a heavily regulated field that what happens, and, you know, Eve and I have done a lot of this together in terms of advising and mentoring new companies for years. And from my perspective, I will listen to whatever the idea is, and it'll be, you know, well, have you thought about, if you want to partner with this hospital, how your compensation arrangement is going to work, because it has to work in a particular way so as not to run afoul of, you know, the anti-kickback statute, for example, or, you know, how are you going to protect the data? That data that you're collecting is incredibly valuable. You know, are you going to be utilizing that later? How are you going to be utilizing that? Who do you want to partner with? Because if you want to partner with a pharma company, they're going to want to own your data. And so how are you going to handle that? Here are things to think about. Or the laws that you need to comply with, both nationally at the state level and internationally, in order to ensure that you can actually use the data in the way that you want to use the data. So it's both advocating as well as guiding in terms of what all the various concerns are going to be.
So Eve, a company comes to you and you like what they're doing, and you basically run a pilot within within the ED or within your department. Now, the big thing for that company, and really if there's value in the technology, the biggest value for the hospital is actually disseminating it across the system, right? So how does that work? Because I think most of the time when you have people that are early stage companies or early stage CEOs, they can come to you and they may be able to convince you. It's a difference between convincing one person who's an end user and then really kind of working with you to get it through the whole system. So how do you approach that, and how does Northwell approach that?
Yeah, so we do it in several ways. We do it internally. Every year, and for about 5 years now, we took a pause with COVID. We actually have an internal innovation competition. This past year, for example, we had 70 submissions. We had 2 finalists. One was a company that used 3D to assess ulcerations and wounds and how they're healing. So we're always looking for these homegrown. That's easier. We know the folks. We have the relationships. They know our pain points. So that externally, it's a little bit more challenging, as mentioned by some of the things Linda mentioned. But I think one of the things I enjoyed about Gil's story was sometimes it's not just the technology. Yes, that's important, but also I look at the founders and what is their ability to negotiate and navigate through all of the things that Linda said. So it's often that question: do you take an A idea with a B team, or do you take a team with a B idea? I always go with the A team, and because they are the teams that will be able to have the resilience to last through the long cycle, to really take the advice that Linda would give. They may be a guild where they didn't start with that exact technology, but are willing to change and be flexible. So these are all the components that we look at. The pilots then need to the point that was mentioned, hit some data marks and show why is this technology going to make a difference in terms of patient outcomes. And there's also the financial piece. The financial piece is tricky. We are still fee for service, but there is this whole promise of value-based purchase. The value sometimes is, we'll take an example. So telehealth during COVID, psychiatry, huge numbers of patients adopted it. But what we also found was the no-show rate was significantly less. And that has tremendous value. One of the things that we don't do well is fill in the gaps. So we have these overhead costs, the doctors, nurses are there, and the patient doesn't show up. Well, that's significant loss for us. Telemedicine, beyond access, it also had this value in terms of the no-show rate. So those are all of the things we try to. I look at the team, I look at their ability to iterate, and then I look at the technology's ability to really show value, be it generate income or save income.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Does it matter in your mind whether the founding team is, has, doctors or MDs on it, or do you find that folks even without a medical degree are willing to kind of step in and learn just as well?
Yeah, so that's okay. They don't necessarily have to be doctors, but there's other ways of doing that. They can get external advisors, how they build their boards. They can have advisory boards. That's also important. Who they surround themselves with, what connections those folks make in terms of introductions, because it's going to take several. I'm sure, Gil, I remember he was on a road trip. He had some consecutive amount of days that he just went on the road. He could tell you more. It was impressive. What was it, Gil?
Yeah, 90. We did the
90 straight days on the road?
90 and 90 campaign, 90 meetings. Wow. And 90 physical meetings in 90 days. This was way pre-COVID.
Yeah. And how many no's did you hear?
The number is probably 90% no's.
Exactly. So
honestly, again, that it was part of the learning. that was understanding that we figured that that was how you listened and understood the market, was to get in front of people and compare their real pain points.
Yeah.
What year was 90 and 90?
90 and 90 was in 2015. There's actually a Entrepreneur magazine profiled it as like a cool thing that some early stage kids did to try to get to the market.
That is a cool thing. I mean, you know, you can spin it however you want. I think there's a level of hustle and there's a level of grit that, you know, you take more meetings, and if you're, you know, the more meetings you take, the closer you'll get to a yes. But, you know, hey, 90 and 90, you appreciate that. That's 3 straight months. That's every single day going after it, and, you know, I think everybody can appreciate that, and it's admirable in a lot of ways. I'll ask you. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Can I respond to that and just maybe also what Linda mentioned? Eve's being too kind, but I do think that the thing is less about, like, maybe this is saying it differently, but a high quality team is one that can surround themselves with the right expertise and recruit the right people to this. You know, I'm sure that for every Steve Jobs who knows all the right answers, there are way more folks who don't and who should just be leveraging the expertise that is out there. And so we thought very early on about, like, how do we get the people who, one, have credibility, and two, you know, have, you know, real understanding of the space, and align as many of them to us as possible, because very few people are going to trust, and for good reason, you know, just us with our, you know, limited track record. And I think what Linda mentioned, and, you know, obviously both Linda and Yves are, you know, evangelists for innovation from different perches, but the hardest thing about getting going is navigating, you know, in a responsible but cost-effective way, the legal and regulatory settings. Unless you're, you know, there's some direct to consumer plays that don't need to, but for the most part, you need to have some way to address that, and you need to have a very similar level of infrastructure to organizations that are, you know, hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, because patient data is sacred, and the only way to do well in this space is to you know, comply with the regulation. So I think figuring that out early, no matter where you are and what stage, you're going to get the same questions, and you're going to have answers to them, and you're going to need to have secure infrastructure. So I think that's like one of the things that's different about healthcare. And, you know, people talk about how it slows innovation, but it enables responsible innovation if you have the right people doing it. But that is, you know, just the reality of dealing in this space that you don't have in consumer tech and other places.
Yeah. You know, I think there's a weird gray area in between the consumer applications and, you know, what I'll call, say, you know, validated and regulated solutions. And, you know, I don't think it slows innovation. I think it's a necessary mountain to climb, because there's a level of trust and there's a level of transparency that you have to kind of stand behind. And it's different when you're talking about a consumer application, because, you know, basically there's a waiver on the data. You're not supposed to use that data for anything really that matters, right? And I think that's a very, very serious distinction between how we actually think about patient health and delivering results, and being able to stand behind what that data means. So I'll get off my soapbox for a second on that one, because I think we can. So this is interesting. You said 90 and 90 was very much pre-COVID, right? So now I don't want to say that we're post-COVID, but we are hopefully entering, you know, that time block. And I'd be very interested to hear all of your thoughts on what, say, the next 18 months holds for healthcare, because we've now, like Yves mentioned, rise of telehealth. You know, systems have actually, you know, recognized that there are, you know, different and perhaps better ways to reach people within certain specialties. And, you know, Linda, from your perspective, we also have a number of regulations that we don't know whether they're going to change. We don't know whether they're going to revert. So I'll give each of you a couple minutes on, you know, the next 18 months. What does it look like? So Linda, I think you're up first.
Okay. Well, it's been interesting to see all of these changes at the federal and state levels in terms of loosening of various regulations and changes to accommodate, what's happening. So in the telehealth context specifically, what we saw the federal government loosen its restrictions in terms of the kinds of platforms that it would deem acceptable from a privacy standpoint and that could be used during the emergency. And similarly, we saw CMS reimbursing for more types of encounters than they had before. And then at the state government level, we saw again, loosening in terms of practicing medicine across state lines. So then the question becomes, well, that worked pretty well, and everyone seemed to really like this and utilize this, and the paradigm now seems to be shifting because there seems to be a desire to continue to utilize this sort of a platform and these sorts of tools even after the pandemic. And so then the question is, well, will the government follow? And I think they will. Just informally, there has been discussion at various government levels about making some of these changes longer term. And so I do see that happening. I think that in other contexts, like for example, with the COVID testing, in the state, there were loosening of certain lab requirements, and the governor just recently changed that because that government order that was issued was supposed to be during the public health emergency, and that has passed. And so in New York State, for example, we have to see what's going to happen, because I think what will happen is that the more traditional lab requirements are coming back, and so that process will be longer. But in the telehealth context, I don't see that. So I think it really depends on what you're talking about. But because there was so much innovation, I think the innovation is going to continue, and I do think that government regulation is going to shift a bit to try to accommodate that innovation.
Yeah. Yves, what do you think?
So, some of the fundamental flaws in our healthcare system still have to be addressed, and technology may actually not solve those, but make it worse. So, as an example, telemedicine. Now we're leveraging telemedicine. We have urgent care, and then we still have our large healthcare organizations. Well, what happens if you go to you have a telehealth visit? What happens to that bit of data, that information? And then now you go into urgent care where you can't see that data. Then you go into hospital. And that's a lot of where the waste happens, and we repeat things. And, I know that there's someone's urine culture sitting somewhere in some urgent care that is not part of my organization, and therefore I don't have access to. So those
are we ever going to get to interoperability? Are we ever going to get there? Because honestly, just as lay people, we can imagine, if I don't have a file, someone can email it to me. And it's probably very difficult for just non-healthcare people to imagine the fact that someone's urine culture could be sitting somewhere and you have no access to it and can't get it. Like, they can't even fax you the test tube. Not that that's a thing.
Well, that's exactly why I bring up these points. I think that we have to still go back to the basics, and we can build all the most brilliant technology that we want, but if we don't solve these fundamental basic issues, we're just going to keep wasting money, and we're not going to give great care, because what happens in that situation, I may give you the antibiotic that's not correct for you. I think that's very important. I think that also when we build our technology, again, and Gil could speak to this, he had a piece about this, that it cannot perpetuate the racial inequities. So we can't build AI that's going to approach it the way we do now. And as a matter of fact, it's even more dangerous because we overly rely on the significance of technology. So if the machine says this is right, we may actually have a bigger problem on our hands. And then the diversity in workforce. We realized during COVID how important that was, the health inequities. But the diversity in healthcare, how important that is in terms of, reaching to the trust that our patients need. And we've seen this with the vaccination, right? The hesitancy, and it depends on who's in front of you may make all the difference in you accepting that or not accepting that. And so, look, I love technology, but again, if we don't go back to the basics, we're still gonna, not be able to deliver healthcare as best as we can and should.
Honestly, your comment about AI is worth an hour discussion in and of itself, right? If we think about the level of disparities, whether it's racial, cultural, whatever, in terms of how we deliver care, we're at a point now where people think about AI in the amount of data that they put into the algorithm. In many ways, they don't always think about which data they put into the algorithm. So if all of the data that we have is on, what I will call biased populations, from a data standpoint, you don't necessarily get solutions that are going to be relevant for all of your populations. So if you have communities that are left out of those algorithms, you are not including them in the potential solution set, and ergo, you're unlikely to get optimized solutions from AI. So I don't know if everybody else has all morning, but frankly, we could talk about that all morning if we wanted to. So Gil, I'm going to kick it over to you. And, I would also, I think if you want to follow on what Yves said in terms of kind of equitable access to care as well, I think we can all start to pivot to talk about that angle too. But
Yeah,
I will let
absolutely.
you expound on the future first.
So I think I'm more skeptical around how much is here to stay. So I've been interacting with a lot of the health centers in New York City, the federally qualified health centers, and from as early as January, February, there were groups that had to push for more in-person visits and push away from telehealth. And the fundamental reason it isn't because they wanted to put their patients or their clinicians at risk, which is what ends up happening, is because they needed to remain financially solvent. And yes, there was reimbursement, but you still made more money by seeing patients in person. And so
Right.
I think those forces are still hard to counter in fee-for-service worlds. About 2/3 of the groups we work with are in value-based settings, and we saw like a pretty steep bifurcation between the groups that could ramp really quickly and already had a lot of the capabilities, to move to virtual, and the groups that on the fee-for-service primary care side hadn't invested in the same levels of infrastructure. And one of the challenges, and this kind of gets to the inequity piece of it, is that there has been historically underinvestment in the safety net, and the safety net health system is where a lot of Black and brown people receive most of their care. And so
Right.
we weren't afforded all the same access to virtual care the same way. And so that's one piece of it. But I think there will be there will be movement forward from a regulatory perspective. Linda's far closer than I am to know when and how, and groups are looking at it. I was serving on New York State's telehealth advisory board, and they are pushing, and there's going to be a fair amount that comes that is going to be I think still very impactful in moving us forward from the positions we were in pre-pandemic, but I think it will take a little bit longer. The other thing I would say is we went from people doing 0% to maybe 10% virtual to 90% through the pandemic, up to 100% at times. There's probably a steady state that looks more like 30%, something like that, where a lot of groups have said like, yeah, we'll continue to do a lot of this. There's a very clear use case, and the organizations that do it well will continue to do it. But it's not going to be 90, 100%. We've already seen that in person has come back. But there have been some shifts. The one that we've seen is that some of the things that were going to the ED were organizations, and Yves may have seen parts of this, but where organizations and or populations were using the ED as primary care. A lot of those people have gotten more comfortable with urgent care, virtual care, other things that are more appropriate for primary care than just going to the ED. And I think that's a a helpful trend for everybody in the system, obviously. And then on the the piece here around health equity, that's the word that I hear in every conversation now coming out of COVID. I think all the large health plans nationally are building it into the way they're thinking about outcomes going forward. I think a lot of the legislation is going to be reframed. Some of the things that are coming with the new waivers in New York State are going to be very heavily focused and aligned to health equity. And I think that the challenge there is going to be, how do we measure health equity, and how do we ensure that we're actually impacting it over time? And so a lot of what we've been talking to folks and thinking about is like the indices to be able to actually show that you're providing more equitable solutions. And I think through the pandemic, as has been said, like every flaw in our system and the inherent systemic racism that we're not immune to in healthcare was exposed, right? All the outcomes were worse for Black and brown people. The access to care, the outcomes. It was just it was just a situation that exposed the things that we already knew about how vulnerable populations were going to fare in a really challenging situation. So yeah, I'll stop there, but I do think that a lot of what we've learned through the pandemic is now being applied through the lens of health equity, but it will require us to be able to measure it and show that we're impacting it in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Well, let's do this between, Yves and Linda. What is kind of in your mind the top thing that we can do to improve health equity and more equitable access to healthcare? Because Yves, thinking of, I'm sorry, Gil, thinking about your intro here, you talked about your mother in Barbados, right? And we have the same problems in the Bronx, right? They just both start with a B. One is closer than the other, but there's a need for care everywhere, and it's not distributed equally. So I would say, Linda and Yves, why don't each of you highlight probably one of the biggest challenges and either a potential solution to that? What are things that could be enacted on now?
Linda, please.
Well, I don't think there's a short answer to this, but I will tell you that I spent all summer last summer thinking very hard about this. This is why I started this task force at New York Bio with Jennifer, and spent 3 months just talking to people in my network across the country about these issues, and identified 3 challenges that I thought were the biggest challenges. One was health equity in terms of delivery of care, and in the context of clinical research, ensuring that there is representation among clinical research subjects, so that there's more equity across the population of people that have access to clinical research that will actually help them. And then the second was trying to promote and support diverse entrepreneurs. In New York in particular, we have an incredibly rich opportunity in terms of both the resources that we have here, as well as the people who are coming up with incredible innovations. And what can we do to really support that is one of the challenges. And then the third is how to create a pipeline of diversity in terms of education and creating the next leaders in STEM, essentially, in all scientific fields. And so I think in terms of the solutions, starting with that latter one, one of the things that we've been talking about is how to partner with and mentor high school students. And Eve and I have talked about, even going back to middle school, to really identify and support who those kids are and make sure that they have access to people that are in those fields that can help mentor them. And there are programs, but they need mentors, and we have that here. So that's one solution. And then with respect to the diversity in supporting support of diverse entrepreneurs, the solution is, we're still working on it, because there's short-term and then there are long-term solutions. The short-term solution is always, let's have a contest. But that to me is both too easy and not particularly effective. You really have to bring together different participants, whether it's, pharma or foundations who can bridge that gap in terms of getting to funding, to come together and really focus on supporting diverse entrepreneurs. So there, the challenges are there, the solutions are there too, but I do think of this as a much more long-term play as opposed to something short-term.
Yeah. I think we've seen examples of this before. Ken Frazier is one. We had Elliot Francis from Bio, another, who both had the impact of, some of these programs that they were kind of fortunate enough to get into when they were kids, either in high school or in middle school. And, Elliot had a really good phrase. He said, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And, we've talked about this, ad nauseum, but you really have to go early enough where, there is something to look up to. There's an option that, people understand is there and is real, and you give people something to shoot for. So Yves, I'll go to you, and I'm going to layer in a question from the audience here, because one of the questions is, how do you actually measure the results of health equity efforts as well? So you have to both fix the problem and tell us how to measure it.
Yeah, so I'm just going to start as saying, but similar to what Linda said, it's complicated. So, but I want to pick up on a couple of things. First is and healthcare and how we deliver it. This whole concept of the bricks and mortar, and that we're going to deliver healthcare inside a clinic, inside a hospital, is outdated. We realize that 80% of healthcare really occurs in the community. And what does that mean? It's the food that you eat, it's the water that you drink, it's the air that you breathe. And we are learning in healthcare that we have to be in the communities. We have to know what's going on in the communities. We have to be involved. Gun violence, that's not something we fix inside. We patch it up, and the folks go back. So healthcare has to really extend its hands truly into the communities. We have to get involved. I think one of the things you asked about, COVID, what will remain? I think that the line has been blurred in terms of your home and your work, and then we're realizing it's all one intertwined aspect. And so I hope that concept continues, that healthcare, we set up pop-up shops for vaccinations in the communities, and that made all the difference. The other piece I would say is the pipeline program. That's something I'm very passionate about. I am a product of, I went to Brooklyn Tech, one of the science schools in New York City. And I was sharing with Linda, in my class at the time, 30 of us, 20 out of 30 of us went to Stuyvesant, Bronx High School of Science, or Brooklyn Tech. And it wasn't just a miracle. There were actual programs that were funded by the city, after school programs. I didn't even realize I was in a program, but it was just natural. And so, I hope that we're now we've had the conversations ad nauseum, we've been talking about this, and now we're gonna start to find solutions. So at Northwell, we have a pretty mature pipeline program. It's about 8 or 10 years, where we've taken high school students, and since then, we've actually gotten, one or two now, I think, have actually gone through high school, college, medical school residency, And I just saw a gentleman yesterday who's a radiologist who went through the program who's going to be an attending. He came to get his ID as an attending. And so we need more of those stories. That's, to me, something easy to measure. In terms of, you know, measuring if our outcomes are going to make a difference, that's a long-term play. You know, we need to close the gap in terms of mortality. We need to close the gap in terms of, you know, diabetes, heart attacks, strokes, et cetera. So, you know, we're not going to see necessarily immediate results, but we have to start the efforts now. Otherwise, we will just look, you know, 10 years, 20 years from now and say, oh, we had these opportunities to fix this problem. And then I'll make one more mention of, you know, what I said earlier. I hope that I don't have to keep mentioning health equity. You know, I hope that this becomes embedded in what we do normally. So if I had to build an emergency department, I wouldn't say, oh yeah, I have to have an EKG machine in that department. No, that's part of how I deliver care. That machine is part of how I deliver healthcare. So health equity is not something separate from what I do. I have to have, you know, translators, right? I have to have modules that allow us to video interact with people who speak different languages. Why are we just thinking about that? Why is Northwell just about to publish? Why is that publishable? That when we don't use translators, our patients wait an hour or two longer. We find out that there's less compliance, that they have additional 30-day readmissions. Why is that a surprise? You know, it's not built into our system. So at least now we're having the conversations, but I hope we in fact do get to solutions.
I would agree. And Gil, I'm actually going to put this into the chat because you had written an open letter over the last little bit, and I'll let you chime in here. I just put your letter in there for everybody here. Why don't you go next?
Sure. I would I'd put forward a few things that I think probably have already been, you know, touched on. So, you know, the challenges, you know, they're there. We've seen them. They've been published. I have a colleague who says, you know, we continue to admire the problem. We write papers. We look at it different ways. We cut it differently. Like that's wonderful. But, you know, we do have to start to move towards what are the real solutions.
Yeah.
I think the tenets of the solution are a few things. So one, you know, and this is from our perch within telehealth. So one is, you know, thinking more broadly about healthcare and moving health into the home. So not the four walls of the hospital, but the four walls of the home, because that's where healthcare starts. You know, as you said, it's what you eat, it's what you drink, it's the air you breathe. It's the people you interact with, it's the trauma that, you know, that's caused by, you know, your social situation. So really thinking about that as where, you know, healthcare is. And then I think enabling clinicians who understand that community. And I'll say clinicians as well as community health workers and others in the community, enabling them with the resources. So I don't think it's enough to just invest in, you know, more MRI machines, you know, at, you know, large academic medical centers. You should be investing in tools and services and things that enable clinicians who are closest to the patients and understand that community and understand that context, because that's where you're gonna, you know, pick up on all of the social considerations. That's where you're gonna understand the key pieces of things that you don't, you know, if somebody goes home, you know, you could give them an inhaler, and if they go home to a home where there's, you know, there's rats or there's poor ventilation, that's actually the problem. The inhaler doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
And so enabling those folks and then leveraging existing community networks. So we think about, you know, schools, churches, nonprofits, those are places that people are already going. How do you start to build tentacles out into those, you know, infrastructure into those organizations, because they already have relationships with members of the community, and they can help you to meet people where they are. That's one of the fundamental tenets, is to meet people where they are. And then the final, you know, piece on my end, I think, is just thinking about the the modalities that we use. So this is from my perspective as a health tech founder. But I think everybody's always thought about telemedicine as, virtual video visits. Sometimes picking up the phone works pretty well. Pick the phone. We've seen people using different text messaging platforms. Like there's a use case in our day-to-day lives for all of these different modalities, and the same is true within the healthcare system. And so how do we build the system in a way that allows clinicians and enables them to use different modalities to interact with patients, right? Like calling somebody back to go through their labs, or telepsychiatry is great. It's a video interaction, but there are some times where you just need to pick up the phone and follow up. And there are some times where patients actually respond really well to text because we've found that there's high engagement. And so thinking through all of those different pieces and not making it a one size fits all version on the virtual care side. So those are some of the things that we've been thinking about that are tenets to kind of creating a better solution going forward.
Yeah, we can think about kind of video enabled visits all we want, but when it comes down to it, not everyone has a nice well lit Skype room behind them for video telehealth visits. And if you don't have that, well, that's not really going to get to everyone that needs it. Again, like you said, if you can reach the people the right way rather than focusing on the next big thing, because unless everyone has access to that tool, you're not going to actually get to the people that don't have access to that tool.
Yeah.
And Eve, you said something before that resonated, which was the blending of work and home into just life, right? And if we're not using the right tools that integrate into what everyone does every day, then you're going to miss things. You can scale up the capacity that you have, but if it leads you to doing more of the same thing, you're still not getting to the right people. So Gil, I cut you off. Go ahead.
I was just going to agree with you. You finished the point I was going to make.
Excellent. At least I said something smart this morning. So tell you what, why don't Linda, why don't we go to you for the last word this morning?
Well, I think what we've talked about here are a lot of really important themes, and the thing that is probably the most powerful to me about this discussion is that we're really talking about committing to making sure that this approach to healthcare is something that is normal, becomes normal. It doesn't become something that we talk about as a special goal, but really becomes routine. And that's my hope. I'm an optimist, so I think we'll get there. The commitment is what it's about, and I'm actually really excited to see where we are right now in terms of that commitment.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think that over the last little while, we've learned that our healthcare system can actually, it can step up and say we need to fix things, and we need to get on this right now. And you only needed to be around for any one of the 7 o'clock applause sessions during the pandemic to realize that the people that we have on the front lines of healthcare are pretty amazing. And I think this is a challenge that now when we think about access, we have a lot of really smart people looking at it. We have a lot of smart people saying, hey, this is a problem and it needs to be addressed. So I think that's incredibly important. Wow, we have so John Pennant says his father-in-law is a Brooklyn Tech alumni from the class of 1938. Amazing. So listen, I want to thank go ahead.
Just want to make one quick comment. I think a group that we haven't really spoken about, and we called them heroes before, our healthcare providers. We have to recognize what they've gone through and the burnout. And everything we spoke about, they're the center of this, and we have to keep them healthy. We have to keep them engaged, and they also need to be part of this conversation. I just didn't want to forget.
Absolutely. Great point. So listen, I want to thank all of you. This was terrific this morning. We could probably go on for another hour. Just as importantly, Linda and Moses and Singer, thank you guys so much. Moses and Singer is a sponsor this month, and been absolutely wonderful, wonderful to work with. So with that, I thank all of you. I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we'll see you all again soon. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.